We're going to hear from Eric Olson. Eric is our director and a lake specialist with Extension Lakes. He has a background in forestry and land use planning. His role at Extension is to help lake organizations develop their capacity to tackle lake management challenges like shorelines and AIS and other things we've been talking about. And today Eric's going to share with us some work that he's been doing on a survey of shoreline property owners around the state. And so let me just share Eric's PowerPoint with you and we'll be off and running. Eric, thank you for being with us and you're hopefully good to go.
Sure, I'm not seeing, oh, there it is. Okay. Thanks again, everyone, for tuning in on what's probably a really nice Friday. I hope you're all looking forward to a good weekend out on the water bodies. If you want to go to the next slide. Just sort of an overview too, the Lakes Partnership is this multifaceted thing. It involves Mike Engelson from Wisconsin Lakes and their advocacy role in lake organizations around the state. It involves the Wisconsin DNR and their powerful role as researchers, as managers of natural resources, and as enforcers of regulations around the state. And they also provide the grants program. And then our piece of this is really what we're calling Extension Lakes. We're based in Stevens Point, as well as Rhinelander, and we carry out the education roles for the Wisconsin Lakes Partnership. So a lot of times you'll hear maybe the Wisconsin Lakes Partnership or UW Extension Lakes or Wisconsin Lakes, and people get maybe the terms caught up, but we're basically the folks doing a lot of the training, education, and outreach statewide. So you're looking at the lovely faces of the people that make up the partnership or the Extension Lakes office. Next slide. So how are we doing? We've been doing this for a while. You know, the Extension Lakes function kind of goes all the way back to Lowell Klessig in the early 1970s and doing outreach with lake organizations to talk to them about ways to carry out lake management. We'd like to think that we play a really powerful role in terms of protecting these lakes and restoring lakes where it's needed. But we don't have a lot of it's hard to find good solid evidence that says, oh, you're doing a really good job. Next slide. So one of the things that, you know, we look for things that maybe we can quantify and measure and look at over time. And this is just one example, sort of drawing off of the Clean Boat, Clean Waters program. This is the shoreline monitoring thing that we talked about earlier. This just shows you over time how many boats are actually being looked at through Clean Boat, Clean Waters. So you can see obvious growth from 2004 to 2019, things sort of leveling off in the last few years, a number of reasons for that. And then we have the 2020 numbers in there already. So those will obviously grow over time throughout this summer. But then there's a question that people asked, you know, are they confident that the boater understands sort of what's going on? And you see sort of the breakdown there between, yes, we think that they agree. They strongly agree that the boater understands things. We feel that this program is being pretty effective. Again, it's pretty hard to tell, as you heard from the eyelids presentation. We look at the rate at which AIS is spreading, and it seems as though the rate of spread is not growing. A lot of people now with their minds thinking about pandemics, there's lots of different metrics you can use to see how fast something is spreading around the state. But we're not being overrun necessarily by invasive species the way we think we would be if there was really no intervention at all. So this is one way to maybe think about how we're doing. Next slide. But we're also thinking, you know, broadly about kind of the things that Mike Meyer was just talking about and Paul Radomski, like are shoreline property owners really aware of what they ought to be doing with their properties? Do they have sort of the awareness and are they taking actions to address things? And how has that been changing over time? You know, are people becoming more knowledgeable about how to take care of their property? Are they taking more actions over time to actually head off things like runoff into their lake or habitat loss? And is there any way to draw the connection between what we see out on the landscape in places like Tomahawk back to somehow education and outreach that we've been doing? And you all maybe face these same questions if you think about an individual lake association or even at the countywide scale. You know, how do you measure success? And unless if you have some sort of benchmark, it's going to be hard, I think, to know if you're moving the needle in the right direction. Next slide. So part of what we propose to the Wisconsin DNR, who really provides the funding for what Extension Lakes does, is that we go out and we kind of collect a benchmark set of data about shoreline property owners, because they are really one of our main targets for communication and outreach all around the state, and that we would establish sort of a benchmark for 2020 by using this survey. We would send this out and kind of collect the information, both use that information to guide programming for the next couple of years, but also have a benchmark then that we could go back and do surveys over time and start seeing whether or not knowledge, awareness, and actions are moving in the direction we want them to. So next slide. This is all made fairly possible by something that you've already seen a little bit, the shoreline parcel inventory. The entire state now has sort of statewide parcel layers that anybody can both view, but also download and utilize for analysis purposes. Just showing here my own little parcel in Stevens Point. What we could do by using GIS is actually try to extract out of the statewide parcel layer what are the shoreline properties. And then once you have those shoreline properties, you can sample from that in order to get a statistically representative random sample of shoreline properties around the state. And I mentioned the deers are here. The work in the state of Wisconsin through both the DNR and the Department of Administration to create this parcel layer was really fueled in part by a report on the previous governor that said it's hard for hunters to find out how to contact rural property owners in order to request permission to hunt on their land. It was more difficult than it needed to be, and the state sits on all this information about who owns parcels. Why not just stitch it all together and put it out there for public consumption? So we're piggybacking off of that. Next slide. And we wanted to kind of get the statistically representative sample, but we also wanted to be able to compare sort of northern Wisconsin and southern Wisconsin. We collaborated with UW River Falls to deploy the survey so that they basically handled the mailing out of the survey to those tax addresses that were mentioned before. So it didn't necessarily go to the cabin itself or the house. It went to wherever the tax bill is going. We were able to do this in the early part of January. So it was about the same time the tax bills were being mailed out. There might have been some properties that were bought or sold in that meantime, but we got a pretty strong response rate. 1,100 responses overall is about, more than what you would need to be able to say the overall results are generalizable to the entire population of shoreline property owners. But on a regional sense, we also had 600 from the northern region. And I'm just kind of showing on this map, those are the counties in white that we consider sort of the northern or cutover region, and then 500 from the southern region or the southeast part of the state. Next slide. And just to give a sense of sort of how these things break down, in this particular question, asking people to judge the overall health of their lake, there were differences between north and south, not terribly shocking. These are the raw number of responses indicating, as you can see across the bottom, whether they don't know if their lake is healthy, whether they would rate it as very poor, poor, fair, good, or very good. And the northern folks tended to say very good in a much more regular fashion than folks from southern Wisconsin. So there's a statistically different response from the northern folks to the southern folks on this particular question. How would you judge lake health? Not shocking. Next slide. Just to kind of see how this breaks down across a couple of questions that are like that, where we ask the same question, how would you rate them? We looked at not just overall health, but also water quality, sort of generically, water clarity, wildlife habitat, recreation, and beauty. And really in all of these, I believe, the difference between north and south was statistically significant. That in general, responses from people who own northern properties gave their lake higher scores for overall health, water quality, water clarity. Habitat was one that was a little bit closer between the two. There wasn't that big of a difference. But then also recreation, beauty was also one where it was pretty close in terms of the numbers. But again, northern folks are generally happier than southern folks. And all you up here in 6-county conference land, you kind of know why this might be the case. These lakes are sort of less intensively developed. They have a lot more public land and undeveloped land around them. They tend to be healthier. Next slide. We also looked at some different problems that might be facing the lake. So asked the question kind of generically, how often are the following currently a problem in this lake? In this case, again, there were similar responses from north and south. The one difference was that they gave the same response, the same type of response to this question of lack of aquatic plant growth. You know, is the absence of aquatic plants a problem on your lake? Both for northern Wisconsin and southern Wisconsin, they tended to say never or rarely. So not a lot of people indicating that they wanted more plants or that they felt that their plant was, that their lake was too short of aquatic plants. Go to the next slide. And here you see that battery of questions about what these potential lake problems were. You can kind of look, we've highlighted some of the ones that maybe jumped out at us, but again, indicating whether or not this is always a problem, all the way down to never a problem. I think in Wisconsin, the fact that if you look at whether or not these things are always a problem, there aren't really big statistics over there or big percentages of people indicating that these things are a problem. And we'd like to pat ourselves on the back, and the DNR and Wisconsin Lakes and all of you really for making this possible, right? What we'd hate to see is if people were saying that all these things were really problematic with their lake. And it turns out that sort of the one that jumps out as having the highest percentage of people saying it's always a problem is really just too many plants on their lake. There's still a perception amongst folks that there's too many aquatic plants on the lake. Either it's often a problem, as indicated there by the 22% statewide, or else it's always a problem, 15%. Then over there on the far right-hand side, you see people indicating again things that are never a problem on their lake. Rarely do people indicate that, especially in northern Wisconsin, that they have a funky smell on their lake, or even the algae bloom numbers I think are pretty solid. But again, these responses holistically, if you go through each one of them, we did sort of a chi-squared analysis to see if the responses were different between north and south. And yes, northern lakes have fewer problems than southern lakes. We'll go ahead to the next slide. We also thought about future threats. So what's kind of coming down the pipeline in terms of potential changes. And again, similar responses from north or south. Hard to find things that were too statistically different between the two. So people, regardless of which lake they were on, whether it was in southern Wisconsin, northern Wisconsin, saw these similar threats. I think the one that pops out here again, kind of indicated on the left there, AIS, is seen as a threat by a lot of people. And to some degree, this reflects, messaging that has been happening from the DNR, from extension lakes, from Wisconsin lakes, and from local lake associations. We really have been trying to alert people to the potential threat of AIS, and you would see here then, not surprising that people agree that this is a threat to the future of their lake. Looking again at the upper right-hand corner, one of the threats that we do face that people aren't necessarily aware of or saying that they're ready to sort of come along with us and understand is really the threat of climate change. Climate change has a number of sort of interrelated impacts on lakes. The weather regimes are changing, the ice is disappearing on southern Wisconsin lakes, ice seasons are getting shorter across the state. Different aquatic invasive species can then become actually viable in Wisconsin as the climate changes that previously weren't viable. So there is this big change, but we haven't really been doing a lot of messaging around climate change. So we shouldn't maybe be too surprised that not a lot of people agree with that being a threat the way they do with AIS. Go ahead and go to the next slide. We wanted to find out, if you wanted to take action to protect your lakes, what do you see as impediments? So the question was worded, as you see in the upper right-hand corner, as you think about maintaining or improving conditions on your lake, how important are the following potential impediments? And again, north and south were seen to be pretty similar in terms of responses. So there might be little differences that you could see in there, but they weren't statistically significant. I wanted to point out a couple of things. How important is the impediment of lack of time? Not very important, it seems. In fact, if you look at the ones on the far right, indicating that they said it's not really an impediment at all, that's the one that has the highest percentage associated with it. So people don't see time as being the issue. But if you look on the lower left circle there, lack of money, a good portion of respondents indicated that that's a very important impediment to taking more actions around their lake. That's on the one hand sort of disheartening. You know, when we think about shoreline property owners, it turns out that there are, we asked questions about income, and we know some things about how people are doing when they're on shoreline property, that they shouldn't be money constrained, but they're still indicating that that might be an impediment to them. And at the same time, we have been working with the DNR and other folks to create programs like Healthy Lakes and even the whole Surface Water Grant Program, which is designed to maybe relieve the expense of doing the right thing. So there are cost share efforts out there. It may just be a matter of us communicating those better and more lake groups taking advantage of Healthy Lakes and cost share programs to get the word out. Lack of support was kind of this question about lack of support from neighbors. Or lack of support from folks around the lake. And you see a pretty high percentage up on that one as well, in terms of whether or not people would say this was an impediment. So go ahead to the next slide. That lack of support question, we were able to actually look at that from a perspective of comparing members of lake associations and lake districts to non-members as well, because that was another question on the survey. So what you see in the little table in the upper left there is the responses to whether or not they said they were members of a lake organization, or whether they are presently or had ever been a leader in a lake organization, like a board member or a president of the lake group. This is kind of, I think reassuring in some ways, right? This table at least says, okay, we have more than half the shoreline property owners around the state would say they're a member of a lake group. I think that's great. That's a good benchmark for us to have. I would argue it should be higher. I think a lot of people, and you're going to hear maybe in the next presentations, that people want that percentage to be higher. But here we have this benchmark now where we could say, okay, circa 2020, we knew from a statistically random sample of property owners that about 54% of folks said they were members of these organizations. We can work then with Wisconsin Lakes. We can work with your local lake organizations, maybe to create messaging and other campaigns to help build membership, to grow the number of members, because there's still a number of people out there we could take on. Now this chart here, though, this diagram shows, and we looked at the statistics, there was a statistically valid difference between members and non-members as to how they identified this particular impediment, lack of support from other lakeshore property owners. And I think what's interesting is how members rated this as a much more important impediment. If they were a member of a lake association, I think they felt that everybody else not being members or not participating was kind of a bigger deal. I'm not sure exactly how to interpret this one, but I know I need to meditate on this one a little bit. And I'm going to want you to maybe feed me some messages from your own experience about why members might think that lack of support from other property owners is an impediment to taking care of their lake. But that did bear out in this data here. Go to the next slide. We asked a series of questions about whether or not people are taking actions to protect their lakes as well, like doing things right now, or whether they had maybe done them before and they stopped doing them, or maybe they've never done this thing, but they're willing to do. So you see on the bottom of this chart, the different options that we gave people to indicate on a series of questions. Either they currently do it, they used to do it, but they no longer do it. They've never done it, but they're willing to maybe give it a try. They've never done it and they really don't have any interest in doing it, or they felt like this question is not applicable to me for whatever reason, just to give people sort of an out. And here again, we're comparing member responses to non-member responses. And the particular question here is, do you volunteer your time to protect a lake? Woohoo! Look at the members of lake organizations stepping up on those, on that currently do one, as well as never done and willing to do, right? Wow. The fact that there's so many people saying that they've never volunteered time to protect their lakes, but they're maybe willing to do that, means that you all as leaders of lake organizations have a lot of people to draw from, a lot of resources out there. Not many people over in that never done and have no interest, although again, you'll see non-members more heavily represented in that particular column. But this is definitely showing us that there's a resource base out there. Go to the next slide. Another one where I think, again, members, again, this obviously stood out statistically as different. Do you talk to your friends and neighbors about lake protection? Currently do, far right column there. Members are doing that. In terms of never done, willing to do, kind of interesting that even those non-members are willing to go out there and talk to their neighbors about lake protection. But on the never done, no interest, you can see that, again, non-members are a little bit different than members. But again, kudos to all the folks who are members of lake organizations and are out there talking to people. Go to the next slide. So this shows that battery of questions. We asked about volunteering and speaking out to neighbors. Those are the first two. Washing your boat to try to minimize how invasives get transferred. Engaging in native plants along the shoreline area. Reducing your use of pesticide, reducing your use of fertilizers, putting in a rain garden and putting in a rain barrel. So these are the types of things that we'd sort of hope, we'd love to see a lot of people, if they're not already doing it, that they'd say they have some interest in doing it or they're willing to do it. But again, as a benchmark, you'll see that people are kind of all over the place. A lot of people take some of the, I would say, really low-hanging fruit, things like not using pesticides and not using fertilizers around the lake. That's great to see those numbers. Those are kind of in that 50%, half of shoreline property owners are already doing that. And a whole bunch of folks are willing to do that. Native planting, kind of, you know, pick on Patrick Goggin here, and there's a lot of people who've never done it, but they're willing to do it. So again, maybe those are those same people, and we're going to do some multivariate analysis of this to see how many of those people would also indicate that cost is their barrier to doing that, or how many people just think it's lack of information that's preventing them from doing that. But native planting is something out there that a lot of folks have the potential to do. And the same thing down there in rain garden. You know, the notion that there's a lot of people, you know, almost a third of respondents who say not only do they not do it, but they have no interest in putting in a rain garden. I find that as striking. As someone who has a rain garden myself, as a shoreline property owner, it's like, what? Why would you not even entertain this idea? So I think we have to get into some of the reasons why maybe people are sticking away from rain gardens as well. And you think about Healthy Lakes as a statewide program that we've been, I think it's almost been in sort of development and sort of getting the machine fired up mode. But once we really want to go hard with promoting Healthy Lakes, these are the kind of statistics that I'd want to see change over time, that more and more shoreline property owners think about doing these native plantings and putting in rain gardens, doing things that actually minimize runoff into the lake. Next slide. So again, the questions on the left were the ones that we sort of want to use as sort of benchmarks for our performance in terms of knowing what we're doing. On the right-hand side, so there are some new questions. Can we look at these results to see any relationship to lake group efforts? So again, if we fire up Healthy Lakes and really go heavy with promotion, can we actually tease out some sort of change over time in terms of participation? And I also want to point out in terms of like building membership and getting that response to the member survey, I have that in the upper right there, from more than 54%, but to being even higher. We want to do that by helping to provide tools to lake groups to build their own capacity. I want to take this moment to remind people, we did send out an email about a capacity survey that we have out there from Extension Lakes and our partners at UW-Madison to kind of get another benchmark. It's a benchmark of how you all feel that your group is doing and how ready you are to maybe do more for lake protection. If you haven't seen that survey, send me an email. If you have seen that survey and you put it off, we'd encourage you to fill it out. We're hoping to kind of get a lot of responses during this month of July. We'll send out some more reminders to get people to do it, but we want to use that again as a benchmark to monitor future progress. And I think that might have been my last slide, Patrick.
I think so. We have a couple of minutes for questions for Eric. I, for one, am excited about how to use this information to do better outreach. Some real nuggets of learning here. Questions?
I do think some of the battery type questions that we have on here, personally, I want to work with Carol Shaw, who's on this, I think he's still on this call, and Allie and your lake groups to think about ways to actually have you incorporate some of those questions into your local lake surveys, such that we can compare your lake against the statewide average. You know, we never really had the statewide average before. So when everybody's doing their independent lake surveys and they're getting responses, it's hard to say like, well, are our people more plugged in than everyone else, or are they less plugged in? What would you compare it against if you don't have some sort of background level to compare it against? So we think that this can be used as a benchmark for lots of local lake surveys, and it might help them think about like, oh, okay, we're doing, our people are less aware of rain gardens, so maybe we should focus on that, or less aware of shoreline buffers. Kathy had a question here. It'd be interesting to know on how many are maintaining a natural shoreline that doesn't require new plantings. Sure, and I think like the work that Mike is doing in these shoreline inventories are going to be important to see as well, that there's a lot of areas out there that are in sort of good condition today and just need to be maintained in that good condition. Do you have some of the questions so we can put out our own survey? Yeah, I can send you the exact survey that we used, and you can, again, some of these questions would be best if you kept them as close as possible to what we use, because that would allow you to do some apple to apple comparisons. So Tina, I can certainly connect that to you.